Ever wonder what an executive order was, how it operates, why the president has to issue them? Are they lawful? Do they need to comply with congressional law? In other words, statutes and laws on the books. And what about the U.S. Constitution? Don't they have to comply with that? Well, we do a tutorial on something we like to call Legal AF. It's sort of like a law school meets a TED Talk. It's every Wednesday and Saturday, 8 p.m. on the Midas Touch Network. And here's a clip, Legal AF After Dark. Take a listen.
Why don't we start with these executive orders and these new lawsuits that are coming out? I mean, first of all, let's talk a little bit about what is an executive order, right? Because Congress is the one who passes laws, and Congress you have to have a majority in the House, majority in the Senate, and then it comes up to the president who signs the bill. And because the framers of the Constitution did not want there to be a king, right? And so you have separation of power. So the Congress will pass laws. The president will either veto it or vote for it. And once he votes for it, it becomes the law of the land, and then judges will interpret it. So what exactly is an executive order if it's not a law? An executive order is something that essentially, he has the power to order his own branch, the executive branch, to do certain things, so long as they don't violate other laws or violate the Constitution. He can't, for example, pass an executive order that forces private citizens to do anything, or that forces other branches of government to do anything. So executive orders, although they're extremely powerful, some of them, they also have some limits and guardrails, also subject to the courts, right, if they're challenged. And so usually what will be interesting with these executive orders, and we'll talk about them specifically, but what I find really interesting is how will the courts interpret these executive orders, because some of them seem just wildly unconstitutional, in my opinion. And also, typically what courts do is when there's a challenge to an executive order, they will typically preserve the status quo during the pendency of the litigation, meaning the executive order will not go into effect, right? Because the status quo, meaning what it was before, usually stays in effect until a judge or a court can determine what an executive order, whether or not it's appropriate. And, examples of executive orders that Biden tried to do, but were challenged in the courts, and the courts shot them down, had to do with student loans, if you remember, right? So you might want to try to do certain things, but they don't always work because the executive power is not limitless. So let's talk about a few of these executive orders. And, frankly, I was thinking when I wrote this down and I was looking at it, I was like, oh, let's talk about some highlights. But I actually think we should call them lowlights, because these are really just shocking and terrible and upsetting, frankly. And one of them, I thought we could start with one having to do with gender. An executive order that was signed by Trump on Monday basically says there's only two genders, right? Females and males. They will be defined at conception. Okay, at conception. And the way it's defined, this is the strangest language I've ever seen. Someone who eventually produces the large reproductive cell would be deemed female. A male would be defined as the person who eventually produces the small reproductive cell. I mean, why can't they use the words egg and sperm even? Yeah. It's so weird. It also says that the federal government would no longer recognize gender identity and only sex as defined by an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. It also prohibits the use of federal funds for any promotion of gender ideology through grants or other government programming, as well as the use of public funding for transition-related medical procedures in prison. And it basically writes transgender Americans out of existence. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me, that executive order.
Mm-hmm. It's so many of his executive orders are like completely unnecessary, just attacks on people. I think we're going to talk about the bishop later, but I felt like that's really what she was calling to, is like, why are you unnecessarily hurting people? Because what does it really harm? He basically saying when you apply for a passport or other federal documents, right now you can check a box female, male, or X, and you can no longer check the box X. What does it harm people to check the box X? It's not harming me if somebody else checks the box X. Like, you are like, mind your own business. And instead, it's just putting so much more trauma on people who have had it. It's so difficult for somebody to come to terms with not identifying with the gender that they were at birth. So difficult to go through the process of transition. So difficult for parents, so difficult for the child. I mean, a friend of mine's child has gone through this, and, she was saying, like, that matters to the child, like, to be able to have a document that matches their identification. What does it hurt somebody? To me, it's like unnecessarily mean. And so that's how I feel about that particular one.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's vicious and cruel, and really takes a huge step backwards. I mean, first of all, I can't imagine what it must be like to be born into the wrong body, the wrong biological body, right? That's got to be traumatizing and difficult and confusing. And I would argue probably not the easiest path and the easiest life. And if someone has the wherewithal and the courage to be able to be their true self, why wouldn't we celebrate that, right? Why would we instead do what he's doing, which is making it not exist anymore in the world? I mean, it's just so upsetting. It's so horrible. And it's just shocking to me that we are moving so far backwards. And I agree with you. It's not hurting anyone else, but yet they feel so threatened by this that, Nancy Mace, the congresswoman, 300 times in one day, she went after the transgender congresswoman. I'm forgetting her name right now, and she said she can't use the bathroom. And it was all about using the bathroom. And they passed a resolution that she can't use the bathroom. I mean, like, I don't understand what's the threat, what do members of Congress get naked in the bathroom? I mean, what is it that, you go into a stall, what difference does it make what somebody looks like when they have to use the toilet, like every single person has to use? Like, I just don't get what the issue is and why they're so upset by it, and why this is so, why this really triggers them so much. They're threatened by this in some really strange way. And they always go to when you have these discussions with people, they always go to the sports analogy. Well, is it fair in sports? Men are just biologically different. And of course, some men are biologically different, right? But they're stronger, they just are, they're bigger, all that stuff. You hear that argument. And it's all about this thing about sports. And, I had this discussion with a very, very, very close person to me recently. And I try not to have these discussions because they can be very upsetting, especially with people that you love and that you're close to. But this is how it came out, was this sports thing. And they were talking about, well, why is it fair that if my daughter worked her whole life to be great at particular sport, and if this is what she was, if this is what, was her dream, why should some guy who suddenly decides he wants to be a girl walk on and crush her dreams because blah, blah, blah. And so I started with the premise that, first of all, it's not a thing. Okay. Let's look up the number of transgender athletes in the country who this happens, blah, 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 whatever. And the number is so minuscule, first of all, in sports. Like, I can't remember what criteria we used, but it was like, I think it was in college. We used that criteria. And it was like, the number was 40 throughout the whole country. And then I said, okay, so now let's Google how many people get struck by lightning a year, and the number is much higher. But we're not talking about lightning, it's just, but they make this boogeyman thing like it's some huge problem. So first of all, it's not a thing. It's not a problem. But they make it a problem. They make this fictitious issue. Number one. Number two, what about people who are just biologically born different? Like, okay, I want to be a basketball player, but I was born 5'1". It's not fair.
Mhm.
You know, how come you, because you're 6'8", get to have an advantage over me? Like, but we're okay with that in that regard. But I don't know. It's just this weird thing that people just freak out about. I don't understand it. And what upset me about it the most is this is a close person to me who considers himself liberal. And somehow this insidious false narrative that is not just false, it's cruel, mean, and does not have any basis in what should be, in my opinion. How did that seep into their vocabulary? That was just really upsetting to me.
I mean, the end of the day, it's because it's winning for them. You know, I was a poll observer in a swing polling location in Clark County, like 2 weeks before the election. And there was campaigning, you know, right before the line where you can't campaign anymore. Somebody on the school board, every voter, she was talking about, keep the girls, the boys in school. They're changing their gender in the school. And I thought, like, this stuff is crazy. I cannot tell you the number of people, the voters who agreed with her. It was so disturbing. But the Republicans have realized this is fear mongering. Misinformation is a winning issue for them. It's not going away. It's why he did that executive order. And in terms of trans children in sports, you know, Utah, you would not consider, you know, liberal state, was able to have a very common sense rule where they said, we will decide on a case by case basis. Because to your point, there's so few athletes where this applies to. You actually can apply a case by case basis. And sure, maybe when you transition will matter whether or not you play on a boys team or a girls team. It's such a common sense thing that solves all the issues. But the problem is this is not about common sense. It's not really about protecting girls and boys sports. It's about they want to use fear to win elections. And the problem with it is that the most vulnerable community, they are so small, they're already hurting, gets hurt more. And that's why, as disgusted as I am by the news and the executive orders, like, I'm not going anywhere because people like that need help. And if we can continue to talk about it and hopefully at some point change who's in charge to make this change, like, I feel like we have a responsibility to do it.
I just realized listening to you, I missed a really good argument that I should have used in this discussion.
Okay.
Because you know, you're right. They use it as a tool to, like, they think they're protecting children, and they think they're protecting children in schools. And that's why people think it's so important. Well, what if they go into the girls' bathroom or girls' sports, or, you know, you're protecting these young children in schools? Okay. Like, what about guns? If you really care about protecting children in schools, what about the number of school shootings there are, and those number of deaths, and that kind of violence, and kids who are affected by that and who are traumatized by that? I guarantee you ask any child who goes in a bathroom with a trans person who uses their own stall and just privately goes in there, you ask, I guarantee you talk to those kids, and then you talk to the kids who were at a school shooting. The kids at a school shooting will say much more traumatized than the trans child. I mean, it's just it's just awful. But they don't really care about that. I mean, look at those numbers. You know, look at what happens, and instead, you know what they do? They all go out and buy more guns because it's just crazy. You know, their answer to guns is it's all about being tough, and I don't know. It just seems so crazy to me.
Welcome back. That was Dina Doll and Karen Friedman Agnifilo. Dina was sitting in with me. She's a great legal commentator. We have her, of course, over here on the Legal AF YouTube channel as well on a regular basis. That's a show we created 5 years ago to sit at the intersection of law and politics for this particular break the glass emergency reason. We don't blow smoke or sunshine on Legal AF, but we do sit at that intersection of law and politics that will be the hottest of hot corners moving forward. We're only 3 days into the Trump administration. We've got about 8 different lawsuits filed against him. We have our first temporary restraining order already issued by a federal judge out in Seattle. We break it all down for you every week on Legal AF. If you're already a fan, we really appreciate you being part of our audience. If that's the first time you've ever heard about Legal AF, we invite you to join us Wednesdays and Saturdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on the YouTube channel for Midas Touch, and wherever you get your audio podcast from. So until my next reporting, I'm Michael Popok. In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.